The bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 sparked conflict between Americans and all people of Japanese descent. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which granted the U.S. military power to ban tens of thousands of American citizens of Japanese ancestry from areas deemed critical to domestic security. The military then issued an order which banned all Japanese people, both alien and non-alien, from areas from Washington to southern Arizona. Internment camps were created to hold Japanese Americans during World War II. The internment of Japanese Americans was applied unequally in terms of geography. All Japanese Americans who lived on the West Coast were interned. 62% of those interned were American citizens. Americans of Italian and German ancestry were also targeted by these restrictions, including internment. 11,000 people of German ancestry were interned, along with 3,000 people of Italian ancestry. Some Jewish refugees were also interned in these camps. Of the hundreds of thousands of Japanese who were forced to go to the internment camps was Fred Korematsu.
Fred Korematsu was born in Oakland, California on January 30th, 1919. He was the third child of four to Japanese immigrant parents. After the U.S. entered World War II, Korematsu tried to enlist in the U.S. National Guard and the U.S. Coast Guard. He was turned away by military officers who discriminated against him due to his Japanese ancestry. He also had a minor plastic surgery performed in order to make his eyes look less Japanese. Around this same time, he attempted to change his name to appear to be of Hawaiian descent. In 1942, at age 23, Fred Korematsu refused to leave his home in San Leandro, California, despite military efforts. He was eventually sent to an internment camp in Utah. Because he violated the military orders issued under Executive Order 9066, he was convicted and appealed by the following courts: the United States District Court for the Northern District of California in 1942, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in 1943, and the Supreme Court of the United States in 1944. Korematsu's legal team included Ernest Bessig, who was the founder and executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, of Northern California since 1971. The ACLU challenged internment of Japanese Americans by taking Korematsu's case to the Supreme Court. Wayne Collins was a civil rights attorney and leader in the legal fight against forced relocation during World War II.
A 6-3 majority in the court upheld Korematsu's conviction. Writing for the majority, Justice Hugo Black held that, although all legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect and subject to test of the most rigid scrutiny, that not all such restrictions are inherently unconstitutional. Pressing public necessity may sometimes justify the existence of such restrictions. Racial antagonism never can. Justice Frank Murphy, who dissented, harshly criticized both the majority and the military order, writing that the internment of the Japanese was based upon the disinformation, half-truths, and insinuations that for years have been directed against Japanese Americans by people with racial and economic prejudice. The court's decision in Korematsu has never been explicitly overturned, although criticized by civil libertarians across the country at the time. Historians, conversely, condemned the decision.
Korematsu's conviction, not the Supreme Court decision, was overturned on November 10, 1983 by Judge Marilyn Hall Patel of the U.S. District Court of Northern California in San Francisco. It was a pivotal moment in U.S. civil rights history. A report issued by Congress in 1983 declared that the decision had been overruled in the court of history, and the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 included a formal apology to the Japanese Americans interned during the war. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded Fred Korematsu the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Korematsu v. U.S. is frequently cited for its statement that all legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect. In 2003, the case Grutter v. Bollinger, dealing with the affirmative action policy at the University of Michigan Law School, the Supreme Court again approved an instance of racial discrimination against the application of blacks' rigid scrutiny standard. Jackson's dissent reminds us of the difficult position the court finds itself in when it assesses claimed violations of constitutional rights in times of war. The chances of revisiting this case are incredibly low after Korematsu's conviction was overturned in 1983. With that said, it is clear that the U.S. government's stance, as well as the public's, has changed since the 1940s. Today, minorities have more equal rights, but as seen in this case and others, civil liberties and rights are diminished in times of war, such as when the enhanced interrogation techniques were enacted under President Bush.
I believe that the United States enactment of Executive Order 9066 was wrong morally and legally. Korematsu, or any Japanese Americans, should not have been forced to relocate. I find it odd that the Supreme Court did not realize how hypocritical it was for the U.S. to force a mass exodus of a certain group of people when, at the same time, we were criticizing the Germans as they were doing the same. With that said, we did not harm the Japanese to the extent that the Nazis harmed the Jews. Still, however, the U.S. government has yet to truly acknowledge their blunder, and for that reason I hope the Supreme Court decision is overturned in the future.
Korematsu versus U.S. was decided incorrectly. I agree with Justice Frank Murphy that this case in the internment of Japanese Americans was not about the protection of our country and our people, but rather out of fear and discriminatory feelings towards Japanese Americans. I do, however, see how the outcome of the case was predictable, for civil liberties are often and usually compromised in times of war or crisis. It's unfortunate and humiliating that we are technically on the same level as the Axis powers during World War II, for we held our own citizens in camps just as they did.